Good afternoon, Liberty Hall friends. My name is Wendy Eaton, and it's a joy to welcome you to Liberty Hall's fourth annual Joseph Smith III Peace Lecture. We greatly appreciate you joining us this afternoon. As we begin, there are a few announcements. We are hosting this event in person at Liberty Hall as well as on Zoom. As many of you know, Liberty Hall Historic Sites is a completely volunteer staffed site. There are no paid employees, but we do have expenses. Our funding is provided by the Community of Christ, assisted by the Historic Sites Foundation and by Friends of Liberty Hall. Barb has dropped the donation links in the chat box, and I hope you will consider making an online donation to support our historic sites. Or you can mail donations directly to Historic Sites Foundation or to Liberty Hall. Barb has posted those addresses as well. And now to our guest speaker, Andrew Bolton. Andrew's peace commitment grew out of his dad's trauma as the British soldiers in World War II. Andrew is thus not naive about the impact of war on families. He grew up a British Catholic and met Community of Christ in Germany as a young adult. A year later, he was baptized in South Wales, the best decision he believes he ever made. First, a high school teacher and a college lecturer. Then he worked for Community of Christ for 18 years as the international coordinator of the church's peace mission among 220 congregations in 10 countries in Asia. In retirement, he serves with Jewel, his friend and spouse of nearly 50 years, in Leicester, UK congregation with the Leicester School Peace Project and in looking after a big garden. He is finishing a book, Living the Sermon on the Mount in Difficult Times, that will be published in early 2025. Thank you, Andrew, for being willing to share with us this afternoon.
Hello, everybody. Following Jesus, the peaceful one in difficult times is our theme this afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever you are. Today is the United Nations International Day of Peace, every year, the 21st of September. This statue is outside the UN building in New York. I first saw this statue as a 19-year-old, the first time I came to the United States. And it still impresses me. The hope of Isaiah, they shall beat their swords into plowshares. I hope every day is a day in which we think about Zion, and I'm going to talk about peace through a Zion framework, Zion for all. Zion, so how do we define Zion? I love this passage from Doctrine and Covenants 36 that's part of the Enoch story in Genesis chapter 7 of the inspired version. Let's look at it. And the Lord called his people Zion because there's one heart and one mind. We're talking about a people who can reconcile, who can come to agreement through processes of common consent, and dwelt in righteousness, dwelt in justice, stand in justice, and do right by their neighbor. And there are people who have abolished poverty. The Lord's Prayer, we can do a similar analysis as well. Together, the big theme is reconciliation and ending poverty when the kingdom of God comes on earth, Zion. But not all went well with Zion in the early days of our movement. And here we are in this picture outside the mansion house in Nauvoo. And Joseph, lieutenant or lieutenant general of the Nauvoo Legion, a body of 5,000 men, only 3,000 less than the US Federal Army of the day. And in the background, you see the Nauvoo Temple, sacred space, and by implication, sacralizing violence. I want to invite you into understanding Joseph III's suspicion about violence. Violence is not as effective as we think it is, not as good as it's claimed. I think the big event, of course, for Joseph III was the assassination of his dad and Uncle Hiram on the 27th of June, 1844. To see his mother's grief, to feel his own grief, marked a 12-year-old boy. When the saints were leaving Nauvoo for the great trek to the Salt Lake Basin, Joseph III, and now 14, was given 3 gifts. Brigham Young gave him a pistol. A friend gave him a large Bowie knife, and for British listeners, that's kind of like a sheath knife. And then Newell K. Whitney, a bishop in the church, gave him a desk. Now, 2 of these 3 gifts are clearly violent, and a desk can also be used for violence or for peace. Which did Joseph choose? The ministry of Joseph III as prophet president of the church is bookended by two wars. The American Civil War, which began in 1861, and then the beginning of World War I in 1914. What does he say about peace? Peace, he said, is eminently our mission. Hence, my voice is for peace, he said in a letter to Samuel Powers a year after the end of the Civil War. The first pastor of the Nauvoo RLDS branch is called the Olive Branch, again calling up a peace symbol. Joseph III is critical of the Nauvoo Legion and critical of his dad and also other leading minds that participated in that. The RLDS gathered in Lamoni, which is named after the only pacifist king in the Book of Mormon. Thomas Sharp used his desk to write scurrilous things about the Latter-day Saints, to preach hatred of the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo. And some people think he was implicated in the assassination of Joseph Jr. and Hiram. But Joseph III forgave Thomas Sharp, greeted him by name, shook his hand in later years. Joseph III in 1893 went to the Chicago Parliament of World Religions, and he went with 6 others. There were 7 or so articles in the Saints Herald of the day. Afterwards, he wrote to a friend in Washington, D.C., saying what a wonderful occasion it was. 2 years later, you have the laying of the foundation stone of Graceland College. It's the corner of what today is the admin building. If you go and look at it, and I recommend you do, you see the words non-sectarian college. I think his experience of the Parliament of World Religions plays into that. And then the next to last revelation that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants has the apostles been sent as apostles of peace, life, and salvation. And his last writing was an editorial in the Saints Herald in which he endorsed United States neutrality in World War I. So these are some of the things that send us in a peace direction. The church seal, of course, is a very significant emblem, sending us in a peace direction. But for the first 52 years, the church seal was used simply as a seal on legal documents. And somebody had a copy of the church seal in the British Isles, and the Canadian bishop had a church seal, and the presiding bishopric had the 3rd church seal. And most church members had no idea of this image. But that changed after World War I, when in 1926 the Joint Council authorized publications of the church to bear the church seal. A report submitted by J.A. Becker, and you can see that on the right-hand side of your screen. J.A. Becker was a member of the presiding bishopric. Paul Hanson was president of the Council of 12. And F. Henry Edwards, a young apostle, called at the age of 25, just a couple of years before, maybe the year before, was a secretary of the Council of 12. He was a British conscientious objector in World War One and imprisoned basically for over 2 years. So from 1926, the church seal becomes the church logo and began to be used on letterhead and church publications and in and on church buildings. Next time you're at the auditorium, hunt on the outside and in the inside for church seals. I don't think we would have this beautiful building dedicated to the pursuit of peace, reconciliation, and healing of the spirit, inspired by the life and witness of the Redeemer of the world, without the church seal. The church seal has brought scripture pictorially into our midst. It's visual theology for the church and greatly beloved. And this year is the 150th anniversary of the church seal. And I hope you're celebrating that in some way in your congregation. If you need a PowerPoint presentation, email me. It pictures the peace of the Messiah in Isaiah 11, the non-violence, the return of Eden and its shalom, wholeness, the return of Zion intended from the beginning. But let's come now to the second part of our theme, peace in our difficult times. The World Economic Forum last year published the 10 greatest risks facing humanity. And they came up with these 10 greatest risks by consulting 1,200 experts and correlating what they thought was important. The first 6 of the greatest risks facing humanity are climate change, one way or another. 7 is migration that could also be caused by climate change. 8 is the erosion of social cohesion that we're facing with the rise of the religious right and the far right in Europe. It's very evident in the United States at the moment. Then 9, cybercrime and insecurity. And then 10, geopolitical confrontation. It's like humanity is sailing on the Titanic, but now we don't face one iceberg, we face multiple icebergs. Difficult times is another way of saying polycrisis. We don't face one crisis or a single crisis. We're experiencing simultaneously polycrises, many at the same time. So what are Christian resources for our polycrisis times? I want to suggest that honest history is one of our resources. It's very important the Community of Christ has committed to doing honest history. It begins with Robert Flanders and his famous book, Kingdom on the Mississippi, The Story of Nauvoo. Honest history is written from the perspective of the cross. Honest history is from the perspective of the victims, not the victors of history. To follow Jesus, the peaceful one, is to follow the crucified one. How do we measure up when we consider the welfare of victims? Church history is good news and bad news. Jesus is good news, and I want to start there. I love these 2 verses at the beginning of Mark's Gospel. Now, the first listeners of Mark would have been exactly that. It would have been read out to them because very few people could read. And this is what they heard. Now, after John was arrested, Jesus came to Galilee proclaiming the good news of God. Everybody hearing this would know that Herod was bad news and Caesar was even worse news, but God was good news. And saying the time is fulfilled and the kingdom of God has come near. Repent and believe in the good news. The Roman Empire is bad. Herod's kingdom is bad. but God's kingdom is coming, and it's good news. Jesus is good news for women. Read the Gospels. I did a study once. All the encounters of Jesus with women result in women having voice and walking away after the encounter with new dignity. Jesus is good news for children. Jesus is very good news for the poor. And Jesus begins his ministry by calling together those first called disciples and teaching them what we call the Sermon on the Mount. The Sermon on the Mount is basic discipleship, as you say in the United States, class 101. And the early church, for its first 300 years, took the Sermon on the Mount very seriously. Now, come with me to York. This is 60 miles from where I grew up. I had my first college interview here in York, and Constantine the Great was declared emperor here in 306 Common Era. He inherited a quarter of the empire. There were 3 other emperors. And his Edict of Milan gave tolerance to Christians, which Christians were very grateful for because they'd already undergone in those first 300 years 10 severe persecutions, and the worst one had just happened, the Diocletian persecution in the decade preceding this. I want you to look a little closer at this statue. Do you see the tip of the sword is broken off? Is Constantine a Christian, and does that affect his behavior? A broken sword perhaps implies a reduction in violence. However, 6 years after York, he's in Rome, doing battle at Milvian Bridge to defeat his rival Maxentius. And he then inherits half the Roman Empire. He goes on to defeat the other 2 emperors, and so he is in charge of the whole Roman Empire. In 325, bishops convened for a council and came up with the Nicene Creed. Constantine participated in that council as a kind of bishop. A year later, he murdered his father-in-law, his wife Fausta, and son Crispus. He increased torture and the death penalty in his reign. There's questions for me about him being a Christian. He invents Christendom, the church-empire merger, the fusion of state and church. And the church now says God has called the king, obey him. And the king uses the sword on behalf of the church. James Carroll is a former Roman Catholic priest, a church historian who wrote a very good history book called Constantine Sword. And this is a summary of his sentiments. When the power of the empire became joined to the ideology of the church, the empire was immediately recast and re-energized, and the church became an entity so different from what had preceded it as to be almost unrecognizable. It goes without saying that the conversion of Constantine for church and empire both led to consequences better and worse, although not for Jews, for whom from this nothing good would come. It gives us a sense of how Christianity has changed with the coming of Christendom. Is Constantine good news or bad news? So let's look at Christendom and its violence. And this is an oversimplistic survey, but to give you a taste. Catholic, the just war tradition enters Christianity through Augustine. Pope Urban II in 1095 launched 200 years of holy war, the Crusades against Islam. The medieval Inquisition is inaugurated in 1184. Be worried if you're a heretic. And then what about Protestants? Just war continues with Martin Luther, who launched the Reformation with great courage. Henry VIII, Church of England, Supreme Governor, replaces the Pope. In his reign, 57,000 to 70,000 people were executed. He executed two of his wives. One could accuse him of severe domestic violence. John Calvin, a brilliant intellectual, French-speaking, in Geneva, encountered Servetus, a Spanish medical doctor, researcher, who came up with the pulmonary heart, lungs, circulation system. A great find, a great discovery, but had other ideas to Calvin about the Trinity. Calvin had him burnt at the stake. Reinhold Niebuhr, a very influential public theologian in the 20th century, speaking around the time of World War II and thereafter, came up with the idea of Christian realism, that you had to use force, you had to use violence to restrain evil, to protect the lesser evil. And then let's just mention in passing European and American empires. This was the export of Christendom. And white people benefited hugely from this, but it was very bad news for indigenous peoples. Let's jump now to the war on terror. Tony Blair, President W. Bush, both Christian men. Where were you on 9/11? Do you still remember that day, what you were doing when 3,000 people were tragically killed? The war on terror was a response to this tragedy. What was the cost? $8 trillion. Nearly 1 million people killed directly, nearly 4 million killed indirectly, nearly 500,000 civilians killed. 38 million war refugees, displaced persons. And I'd like to say America and its allies were more brutal in their revenge than anything the Roman Empire ever did. But the really sad story for me is that 7,000 US troops were killed in action, but 28,000 US troops committed suicide afterwards, not able to live with what they'd seen or participated in. Now let's do a quick summary of Christian nonviolence plus Gandhi. The early church is committed to nonviolence. Monastics, clergy, and Franciscans in Christendom still followed the Sermon on the Mount. We come to the Anabaptists, the left wing of the Protestant Reformation, who arose after the German Peasants' Revolt. They also follow the Sermon on the Mount. They're one of the historic peace churches. The Amish in Lamoni come from these people, as well as Mennonites and Hutterites. The Quakers arise in 1652 at the end of the English Civil War. They're also a historic peace church. They participated in ending slavery non-violently in the British Empire in 1833. They won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1947. They're the only religious movement ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. Gandhi won Indian independence using non-violent methods. The American Civil Rights Movement ended segregation by suffering, by following the Sermon on the Mount, by being inspired by what Gandhi had done, and through the leadership of the Black churches. And Cesar Chavez is another non-violent worker, mobilizing farm workers in California, Filipino and Mexican, to stand up for their rights, but again, using non-violence. But are these stories exceptional? Erica Chenoweth and Maria Stephan have looked at the conflicts the world has experienced since 1900 to 2020. They analyzed 565 campaigns. What did they find? 51% of nonviolent campaigns were successful, but only 26% of violent campaigns were successful. Let's just pause a moment here to understand what's going on. This is saying that nonviolent campaigns were twice as successful as the violent campaigns of the last 120 years. There's more. Non-violent campaigns are much more likely to end in democracy. Only 4% of violent campaigns ended in democracy. Like Joseph III, I am suspicious about violence. But now we know that non-violence can be more effective than violence. Joseph III has been called by Roger Launius the pragmatic prophet. So what does it mean to be pragmatic about peace and justice in polycrisis times? Let me remind you of the 10 greatest risks that we face as humanity. The first 6 are to do with climate change, then migration, then erosion of social cohesion, then cybercrime and insecurity, and geopolitical confrontation. How do we follow Jesus, the peaceful one, in polycrisis times? I suggest with realism. Christians in the darkness of Crucifixion Friday cannot but be realistic about human evil. And yet, in the early morning light of Easter Sunday morning and an empty tomb, Christians are the most hopeful. Realism, hope, we dance between the two. And Martin Luther King Jr. captures the tension between these two when he said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. History is a long time, but Zion is coming, folk. And our first action to face the terrors before us is to imagine Zion for all. Zion cannot come. The kingdom cannot come on earth unless we first of all imagine that possibility. So dream, O people of Zion. Dream also that the coming Zion is a peaceable one. We can be armed by at least three of the enduring principles. Sacredness of creation, for earth is our home. The worth of all persons, I mean that, no exceptions. And responsible choices. Zion is green or is nothing today. I want to invite you or challenge you to work out your carbon footprint. The World Wildlife Fund is a good site to go on. The news is that unless we halve our carbon footprint by 2030, our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to inherit hell on earth. Following Jesus, the peaceful one, means studying and living the Sermon on the Mount. It's not enough to have nice feelings. We need to be equipped by this basic discipleship course that Jesus begins his disciple training. There's a book coming out, Living the Sermon on the Mount in Difficult Times, I hope before conference. Look out for it. The beginning of the Sermon on the Mount begins with the Beatitudes. It begins with blessed are the poor in spirit, and it's like there are a ladder or steps in progression of the discipleship way. The outcome is salt, light, city on a hill. When we courageously stand up for justice, we're salt, light, city on a hill, a people of peace. I want to tell you that I believe our congregations can be cities on hills. And here's the Leicester congregation, which Jewel and I are members of. You see Jewel in the background. I'm taking the photo. I believe in the gathering. Jewel and I moved back to Leicester 6 years ago, and we are 5 minutes walk from the congregation, so that we step onto the sidewalk or pavement, we're already interacting with neighbors in our patch. There's been more intentional cities on hills. This summer we were at Onset, Massachusetts. This is a campground that began in 1911, and people now live there all the year round. It's an intentional Christian community. And I saw this sign at the entrance, Grow Peace Here. Harvest Hills, where Jewel and I lived for 20 years with our boys, has been called Tiny Zion by Brian Montes when he did his PhD about this community, started by Community Christ folk in 1972. Those are big projects, but I want to make it simple. I want to speak of the effectiveness of twos. You'll remember that in Matthew's Gospel and Luke's Gospel, Jesus sent out disciples in twos, without staff, which could have been a defensive weapon, as lambs among wolves, with a message of peace. Ron Romig and I, we lived in Harvest Hills, we were neighbors, shared a car. We bought it together and shared the running costs of it. We halved our carbon footprint and saved money together. The Leicester Schools Peace Project is a project that Jewel, a primary school teacher, and myself, a secondary school teacher, have started in this city. We've been community organizing on the school traffic issue on our street and a neighboring street. Jewel and I interviewed, surveyed nearly all the homes on these two streets. We found that school traffic resulted in 35 cars of residents being damaged, 3 cats killed, and a child bumped. We organized a meeting with people from the school, from residents, city council officials, and the police. 37 people came. A member of the council said he'd never been to such a large meeting on school traffic or any kind of traffic issue. But it started with just 2 people. The European Peace Colloquy has now been held 3 times. Just 2 people started each time. Migration justice is an issue in both our countries. Leicester is an immigrant city, and 2 people, Ros Birch, an Anglican, and Zain Hafiz, with 10 years experience of the British immigration system, got together and then invited others of us to join them in an ongoing campaign to influence policymakers, our members of parliament, on making it a fair deal for migrants. The climate emergency resolution that came to World Conference last year was hatched by 2 Andrews, not me, in the Claycross congregation 50 miles from where I'm sitting at the moment. Just 2 people started something big. And there's a move to do something about Israel-Palestine, and just 2 people are again doing that. But of course, they're inviting more. And 7 of us are going to Israel-Palestine this November on a study tour, fact-finding tour, to find out more on the ground about what's going on and to report back to the church. 2 people can change the world. It's not that 2 people do this on their own, but 2 people can start to change the world. I want to recommend that we work with others. Ask who else is doing peace in your neighborhood. In the British Isles, we're part of the network of Christian peace organizations, and we join Anglicans and Catholics and others that are committed to doing peace in this country. And in Leicester, we've joined with Citizens UK, working with people in mosques, gurdwaras, Hindu mandirs, and synagogues, and schools, and so on, to do justice in our city, to listen to those not normally heard. We work with others. We do the International Community of Christ International Peace Award. Consider doing a Congregational Peace Award in your city or in your neighborhood. You can make it a good publicity event, as well as honoring and encouraging somebody who deserves. I mean, you don't have to give money. I have a whole story about that. People are honored just to be given some kind of award. The smallest peace project done is better than the biggest dream of Zion left undone. Think big, start small, but start.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your research today. Well, it's time to bring our fourth annual Joseph Smith III Peace Lecture to a close. Thank you again, Andrew, for sharing your insight and knowledge with you. Thank you, Barb, for helping and making this event a reality. And thank you, Paul, and the Liberty Hall team for hosting this program both in person and online. We share our thanks to you, our friends in the audience, for seeking to more fully understand Community of Christ's historic journey and all its complexity. Lastly, thank you to your generous support for helping preserve and maintain the Community of Christ's historic sites, especially Liberty Hall. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.